The richest man in New York had not been touched by another human in 3 years. Ethan Cole lived on the 92nd floor of a glass tower that shimmered above the skyline, a man surrounded by luxury, yet starved of warmth. From his window, he could see the pulse of the city below yellow taxis, steam rising from greats lovers walking arm in arm, but none of it reached him. His penthouse was quiet, sterile, a museum for a man who could not bear to be human. The piano in the corner was perfectly tuned, but untouched, the marble floors cold beneath his bare feet. Every night he sat there with a glass of whiskey and the weight of silence pressing against his chest. The world called him cold, arrogant, untouchable, but they were wrong. He was simply afraid. The fear was not of failure or betrayal, but of himself. There was something about his own body that terrified him, something that made people leave. Once a woman had whispered she was sorry and fled before the morning light. Her voice still echoed in his mind, cutting through the years like a wound that refused to close. Since then, Ethan had built walls higher than his skyscraper walls no one could climb. Every interaction was measured. Every meeting was distant. He wore gloves when signing contracts, declined handshakes, and let no one come close. Reporters called him the untouchable billionaire, painting him as a mystery of power and pride. In truth, Ethan was neither. He was a man consumed by shame, an invisible burden that turned touch into danger and intimacy into exile. When his reflection stared back at him each night, he could hardly recognize the man he saw. The mirror showed strength, success, control, but behind that there was emptiness. He sometimes whispered to his reflection, "You're too much for anyone," and the glass fogged with his breath before swallowing his confession whole. Ethan was 35, the head of Cole Capital, a financial empire that moved billions each day. Yet no amount of money could buy him what he wanted most: peace. He had mastered the markets, outsmarted competitors, but could not outthink the ache that lived beneath his skin. He used to love music. As a child, he had played piano beside his mother until her death, the melodies wrapping their evenings in warmth. Now every note reminded him of what he lost, the simplicity of connection. Sometimes he would press a single key and let the sound fade, wondering if that echo was the closest thing to being touched. He avoided the city's noise, choosing silence instead, but even silence can become deafening when it hides too much truth. Late at night, he would stand by the window looking down at people laughing, kissing, colliding in motion, all the messy, beautiful chaos he denied himself. He had convinced himself that loneliness was safer than rejection. But safety had its own price. It hollowed him out from the inside until he was nothing but the echo of a man. His father's last words haunted him still. "Don't let fear make you smaller than you are." Ethan had never known how to be anything else. On a snow-heavy night, sleep eluded him again. He walked barefoot to the piano, the city lights painting faint gold over his hands. He hesitated, then struck a note, soft but trembling, and for a moment the sound filled the room like a heartbeat. His heart followed unsteady, searching for something to hold on to. He closed his eyes, but the memory of the woman who had left him came rushing back, the shock in her eyes, the silence that followed the way her footsteps had sounded like judgment. The piano fell silent again. Ethan took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "You are too much for anyone." His voice cracked the words, sinking into the darkness. Below, the city carried on. Somewhere in the snow-covered streets, a woman was walking home after a late session at the music academy. Her name was Grace Hale. She carried a worn violin case, its leather frayed at the edges, her scarf trailing behind her, like a small flag of defiance against the cold. She was not rich, not famous, but her music had a warmth that reached places words could not. She had no idea that her life was about to intertwine with his, or that her next client, the one she had agreed to take on out of pure compassion, was the man who had forgotten how to be touched. In his penthouse, Ethan turned off the lights and stared at the blackness around him. He thought the world had nothing left to offer, but fate was already setting the stage. Somewhere below the snow and noise, a woman was walking toward him carrying nothing but a violin and the power to make silence sing again. Morning arrived in muted tones over Manhattan, the kind of gray dawn that made the glass towers look like ghosts of themselves. Inside the top floor of Cole Tower, Ethan Cole's empire awakened not with laughter or chatter, but with the soft hum of machines and the sterile rhythm of efficiency. His staff worked with precision, aware that silence was not just expected, it was required. The Coal Capital headquarters was a reflection of its owner, immaculate, intimidating, and emotionally impenetrable. Ethan entered through a private elevator, his face expressionless, his steps soundless against the marble floor. Employees straightened in their chairs when he passed, but no one dared greet him. He preferred it that way. Connection was risk. Familiarity was a door he could not afford to open. He went straight to his office, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. From here, the city looked peaceful, orderly, small. It gave him control, and control was the only thing that kept his fear in check. He sat behind a desk of dark walnut, opened his laptop, and began to read reports, numbers, and projections, all perfectly predictable. Numbers never judged him. Numbers never flinched. At exactly 9:30, his assistant Max entered carrying a folder. Max had worked for Ethan for 8 years, long enough to read his moods without asking questions. "The Tokyo investors are confirmed for next week," Max said carefully. "Also, there's something else." Ethan looked up, his gray eyes sharp but tired. What kind of something? Max hesitated, which meant it was personal. "Your father's lawyer sent the final letter from the estate." Ethan's expression faltered for the briefest moment. He extended his hand. The letter was sealed with the family crest embossed in gold. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he stared at it as if it were a weapon. His father had been a man of contradictions, kind, yet relentless, powerful, yet soft-spoken. They hadn't spoken in the last year before his death. Ethan finally broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. "My son, if you are reading this, I am gone. I know you believe isolation keeps you safe, but safety is not living. Don't protect the world from your pain. Find someone who reminds you that you're still alive." The words hit harder than any loss report. Ethan folded the letter slowly, his throat tightening. He slipped it into the drawer without comment. Max stood in quiet sympathy, but said nothing. He knew better than to speak when the air thickened like this. Ethan finally exhaled and asked, "What else your insomnia?" Max said. "You've canceled every session the doctor recommended." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm not interested in therapy." "This isn't therapy," Max replied, placing another folder on the desk. "It's music." Ethan frowned, reading the profile inside. Grace Hale, music therapist, former consultant at the New York Veterans Rehabilitation Center, specialized in trauma-related anxiety. "Music therapy," Ethan muttered, unimpressed. "What am I supposed to do, sing my fears away?" "It's not about singing," Max said calmly. "It's about sound. She works with soldiers who can't sleep because of what they've seen. Maybe she can help someone who can't sleep because of what he's hiding." Ethan shot him a warning look, but there was no anger behind it, only weariness. "I don't need help," he said. I need control. Max's tone softened. With respect, Sir Control hasn't helped you sleep in 3 years? Silence filled the office again, heavy and sharp. Ethan finally leaned back in his chair. Fine. Schedule 1 session. After that, I don't want to hear about it again. Understood, Max said. She'll come to the penthouse on Wednesday evening. Ethan's eyes flickered with hesitation. To my home. That's her condition. She only works where her clients feel most at ease. Ease, Ethan repeated quietly as if the word belonged to another language. When Max left, Ethan stared at the city again. From this height, the people below looked like ants too small to hurt him. But even from here, he could not escape himself. The letter in his drawer felt heavier with each passing minute. He opened the lid of his piano, pressing one key softly. The sound drifted like a question unanswered. Wednesday arrived with the chill of approaching winter. Ethan spent the day convincing himself that this meeting would be nothing, a polite experiment, a box checked for Max's peace of mind. But when evening came, his composure began to crack. The penthouse felt even larger than usual, each step echoing through the empty rooms. He poured himself whiskey and waited, eyes fixed on the clock. 7:30. The doorbell rang. He froze. It had been months since anyone had stood on the other side of that door. He took a breath and opened it. She was standing there, wrapped in a long beige coat, holding a black violin case in one hand and a small notebook in the other. Her hair was dark chestnut, her eyes calm but alert, like someone who'd seen enough pain to recognize it in others. "Mr. Cole," she asked softly. Her voice was low and musical, carrying warmth into the sterile air of the penthouse. Ethan nodded once. "Come in." She stepped inside, glancing around the space, not in awe but in observation. Her gaze lingered not on the chandeliers or art pieces, but on the piano, the bookshelves, the untouched mug on the table. "You have a beautiful home," she said. "Cold, but beautiful." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware beauty required warmth." "Everything does," she replied simply. He gestured toward the seating area. "Max told you why you're here, I assume." "He said you haven't been sleeping," she said, sitting down and setting her violin case beside her. "That's usually a symptom, not a cause." Ethan folded his arms. "I don't talk about causes." "Then we'll start with silence," Grace said. "It's louder than most people think." Ethan studied her, uncertain whether she was mocking him. But there was no judgment in her eyes, only quiet certainty. She opened her violin case and drew the bow across the strings, producing a single haunting note. It filled the air, soft at first, then deep and resonant, reaching corners of the room, untouched by sound for years. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, something dangerously close to emotion. He looked away, jaw clenched. When the last vibration faded, Grace spoke without looking at him. "This place echoes," she said, "but echoes only exist where something's missing." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't know how. She closed her violin case, stood, and smiled faintly. "We'll start again next week, same time." He managed a small nod, still caught in the lingering sound of that single note. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Ethan stood motionless, the silence around him heavier than before, yet somehow different. For the first time in years, it did not feel empty. It felt expectant. Grace Hale walked into Ethan Cole's penthouse again, the following Wednesday evening, the same violin case in her hand, her steps light but sure. The sunset had painted the skyline in orange and blue, and the room with its glass walls and clean edges looked less like a home and more like a high-altitude museum. She placed her violin on the coffee table and looked around. "You didn't move anything," she said with a hint of amusement. "I like order," Ethan replied. "Chaos makes me restless." "And silence?" she asked, glancing toward the grand piano. Silence is control, he said, his voice flat. Grace smiled faintly. Silence is fear disguised as control. There's a difference. Ethan's brow lifted slightly, unused to being analyzed so openly. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, walking slowly to the piano instead. "May I?" she asked. "It's just an instrument," he said, though something inside him tensed. She pressed a key softly, letting the note hum in the air. "No," she said quietly, "it's not. Instruments, remember, they hold emotions long after we stop playing them." Her hand hovered over the keys, then dropped to her side. "When was the last time you played, Years?" Ethan said curtly. "Why?" "Because I lost the reason," he replied, staring at the city lights below. "You lose a person, not a reason," Grace said. Ethan turned toward her, eyes narrowing slightly. "You read minds too." "No," she said gently. "I just listen." She moved back to the couch and opened her notebook. "Tell me about your sleep." "I don't sleep," he said simply. "And when I do, I wake up remembering I shouldn't have tried." "That sounds like guilt." "It's just memory," he said, his tone sharpening. Grace didn't flinch. Memories and guilt often sound the same. She wrote something down, then looked at him again. "Do you dream?" "Not anymore," Ethan said. "Dreams are for people who can still feel safe." Grace studied him for a long moment before replying, "Safety is overrated. Healing isn't." Ethan almost smiled. She intrigued him not because she was different, but because she didn't seem afraid of him. Most people filled silence with chatter. Grace filled it with presence. The air between them had texture now, as if sound itself had weight. She reached for her violin and began to play just a few low notes, deep and slow. The sound wasn't pretty. It was raw trembling, as if the strings themselves were confessing something. Ethan felt his throat tighten. "What is that?" he asked. "A Bach sarabande," she said. "It's about loss that refuses to fade." He looked away, but the music followed him, curling around his defenses like smoke. When she stopped, the silence that followed felt unbearable. Grace closed the case gently. "You don't have to talk," she said. "But eventually the silence will start speaking for you." Ethan wanted to tell her to leave. He wanted to end this intrusion, to retreat behind his familiar armor. But something about her calm voice and the way she looked at him without pity, without fascination, made it impossible. He stood by the window, his reflection overlapping hers in the glass. "Why did you become a therapist?" he asked. Grace's gaze flickered, and for the first time her composure softened. "Because someone once saved me," she said. "My husband. He was a firefighter. After he died, I realized music was the only language that could still reach me." Ethan turned slowly. "I'm sorry. Don't be," she said softly. "It's what taught me that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the space where truth waits to be heard." The way she said it lingered in his mind long after she fell quiet. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something other than emptiness, a small, painful flicker of curiosity. He asked, "And what truth do you think is waiting for me?" Grace smiled faintly. "That depends on how long you've been trying not to hear it." She closed her notebook and stood. "We'll keep today short." Ethan frowned. That's it," she said, slinging her violin case over her shoulder. "You're not ready to be fixed, Mr. Cole. But maybe you're ready to stop pretending you don't need to be." Her words landed with surgical precision. He should have been angry, but he wasn't. He watched her leave, his pulse steady, but his thoughts spinning. When the elevator doors closed, he returned to the piano and pressed one key. The note echoed the one she had played earlier, and for the first time, he didn't stop it. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Cole Capital early, but work refused to hold his attention. The sound of the violin haunted him, intruding between lines of numbers and reports. Around noon, Max entered with updates, but Ethan interrupted. "That therapist," he said. "Did she say how long this program lasts?" "It depends on the patient," Max replied cautiously. "Are you continuing?" Ethan hesitated. "For now." That evening he poured himself another drink, but the taste of whiskey suddenly felt dull. His eyes drifted to the piano again, to the faint trace of dust she'd disturbed when she played. He sat down and tried to mimic the notes she had performed. His fingers were stiff, clumsy, but the melody came back in fragments. A sound escaped his throat, a laugh, or maybe a sob. He wasn't sure. On Friday he did something that surprised even himself. He went out. No bodyguards, no chauffeurs, just him walking through the snow-covered streets of the Upper West Side. He found himself standing in front of a modest brownstone with a sign that read, "Hale Music Therapy Studio." He almost turned back, but the door opened before he could decide. Grace was standing there bundled in a coat, her hair tied loosely. She looked surprised, but not startled. "Mr. Cole?" she said, her lips curving slightly. "You're 2 days early." "I don't wait well," he said, his breath visible in the cold. "I noticed," she replied. "Would you like to come in?" He hesitated, then nodded. The studio was small and warm, filled with instruments and the faint scent of tea. It felt nothing like his penthouse. It felt alive. Grace poured tea into 2 cups, then sat across from him. "You don't strike me as someone who visits people twice a week," she said. "I don't," Ethan admitted. "I just wanted to understand why your music felt like pain." "Because it was," she said simply. "Pain is where most truth begins." He studied her face, and for a fleeting moment he wondered if she could see through him entirely. "You said instruments, remember?" he murmured. "Do people only if they stop running?" she said. Her eyes held his. Neither looked away. A clock ticked softly in the corner, counting seconds that suddenly felt heavy. Ethan rose. "Next Wednesday," he said quietly. "Same time." "I'll be here," she replied. He nodded once and left, stepping into the cold night air. As the snow fell around him, Ethan realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to something. Grace Hale had entered his silence, and somehow, without saying much at all, she had already begun to change its sound. Every Wednesday evening, as the city dimmed into gold and steel, Grace Hale arrived at Ethan Cole's penthouse with her violin case in one hand and a thermos of chamomile tea in the other. At first, their meetings followed a strict rhythm: 30 minutes of music, 10 minutes of quiet conversation, and then she would leave before the clock struck 9. Ethan liked order, and she respected that, though sometimes she broke his rules without asking permission. The second week, she rearranged the chairs to face the window so they could look at the skyline while they talked. The third week, she brought sheet music for a duet. The fourth, she poured him tea and refused to let him drink whiskey during their session. "Tea won't fix me," he said. "Neither will whiskey," she answered. He smirked despite himself. Slowly, imperceptibly, the penthouse began to change. The piano was no longer just an ornament, but a companion. A faint scent of lavender began to linger after her visits. The silence, once heavy and cold, grew softer, warmer, almost alive. Ethan found himself anticipating the sound of her footsteps in the hallway, the delicate click of her violin case opening the low hum of the first note. Grace had a way of filling space without demanding it. She spoke when necessary and stayed quiet when words would only bruise. Their conversations deepened, threading through loss, loneliness, and memory. One evening, as rain pattered against the glass, she asked, "Do you ever miss who you were before the world told you to be this?" He hesitated. "I'm not sure there was a before. Everyone has a before," she said. even if it's just a shadow. He looked at her and wanted to believe that was true. She played a piece called Reverie for the Lost. The melody was slow, mournful, but not hopeless. When she finished, she left the bow resting on the strings and asked softly, "What do you hear in that regret?" he said. "And possibility." "Good," she said, smiling. "Then we're getting somewhere." Week by week, their routine wove itself into something resembling home. She brought her own small comforts, a candle, once a playlist, another time even cookies from a bakery she liked downtown. Ethan pretended to be indifferent, but he noticed every detail, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she tuned her violin, the faint scar near her wrist, the softness in her voice when she spoke about her late husband. Once she told him about the fire, how she had watched the building collapse from the street, knowing he was inside. "People kept telling me to move on," she said quietly. "But moving on isn't healing. It's pretending. So I found a way to make pain sing instead of scream." Ethan listened, something in him unraveling at her calm strength. He realized he had never been in the presence of someone who could hold pain so gracefully. The next week, he surprised her. When she arrived, he was already at the piano, playing haltingly through a simple piece she had shown him. He stumbled on the rhythm, but when she smiled, something in his chest loosened. "Not bad," she said, "for someone who swore he'd never play again." "I didn't swear," he said. "I promised myself." "Same thing," she replied. "Promises are just fears in disguise." He chuckled. "Do you analyze everyone who crosses your path?" "Only those who hide behind skyscrapers," she said. She moved beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm as she guided his fingers over the keys. "Try again," she murmured. "Slower. Let the note breathe." The moment her skin touched his, he froze. His instinct screamed to pull away, but he didn't. The warmth was faint, fragile, but real. She noticed his stiffness, her voice lowering. "It's just touch," she whispered. "Not judgment." His hands trembled. "For me, they've always been the same." She looked at him, then really looked and said nothing. Silence fell again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything they both couldn't say. When she finally left that night, Ethan stood at the window long after replaying that single moment over and over, until it became unbearable. The next morning, he woke early, restless. The city was bathed in fog, and yet he felt something resembling peace. He brewed coffee and found himself setting out an extra cup before realizing she wasn't coming that day. He laughed quietly, embarrassed by his own sentiment. Later that week, during a board meeting, his mind wandered. He was supposed to be reviewing merger documents, but instead he was thinking about how Grace's hair caught the light when she leaned over the piano. Max noticed his distraction, but said nothing. The change in his boss was subtle, but unmistakable. He stayed later at the office, but seemed calmer. He smiled at small things, a clean cord, a message from Grace confirming their next session. Even the staff whispered that the ghost in the glass tower looked almost human again. One evening, Grace brought him a new piece to learn. "A duet," she said. "You play the left hand. I'll take the right." "I don't duet," he said. "You do now," she replied, settling beside him. Their fingers danced across the keys, hesitant at first, then finding rhythm. The melody was tender, almost fragile, and when their hands brushed, neither pulled away. When the final note faded, Ethan exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for years. That Grace said softly is connection. No words, just sound. He looked at her, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. The skyline, the empire, the endless noise, all of it disappeared beneath the simplicity of her gaze. But peace was fragile. After she left, Ethan sat at the piano again, repeating the duet until his fingers ached. He realized he was afraid not of being touched, but of needing it. He had built a life on the certainty that no one could reach him. Now someone had, and it terrified him. He wrote an email that night, half confession, half gratitude, but he never sent it. The draft remained on his laptop, a quiet echo of what he couldn't yet admit. "She makes silence bearable," he had typed. The days that followed blurred into weeks. Their meetings became the rhythm of his life, the only constant that didn't feel like duty. Grace teased him once about how predictable he'd become. "You like routines, Mr. Cole," she said. "They make the world less dangerous." "You make it less quiet," he replied before realizing how vulnerable that sounded. She smiled, understanding too much. "Then maybe we're both doing our jobs." Winter deepened and the city turned silver with frost. From the street below, his penthouse still looked like a fortress of glass. But inside, something human had begun to bloom. Grace didn't just bring music, she brought air. She taught him that silence wasn't absence. It was a pause before something beautiful. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, she ended their session early. "You're improving," she said. "You don't need me as much." Ethan looked up sharply. "Don't tell me what I need." She smiled gently. "Then you tell me." He couldn't. The truth hung between them, soft and dangerous. She picked up her violin case and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Same time next week?" He nodded. After she was gone, Ethan stood in the center of his penthouse, surrounded by the faint echo of her music. For the first time in years, the silence no longer frightened him. It sounded like waiting, and for once, waiting didn't hurt. The first crack appeared on a Monday morning disguised as a headline. Ethan Cole had just arrived at his office when Max entered, his face pale, a folded newspaper trembling in his hands. "You should see this before the board," he said quietly, placing it on the desk. The bold black letters screamed from the front page of the New York Daily, "The Untouchable Billionaire," and his secret affair inside the penthouse of Ethan Cole. Below the title was a photograph taken at night, grainy but unmistakable Grace, leaving Ethan's building, her violin case in hand, her face half hidden by a scarf. Another photo showed Ethan's shadow framed in the penthouse window above. The article painted a scandal, a powerful man exploiting his therapist, a woman trading professionalism for privilege. The story was fiction, but fiction had always sold better than truth. Ethan felt his chest tighten as he read. The words didn't just expose his privacy, they mocked the one thing he'd begun to believe in again. "Who leaked this?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to slice the air. Max shook his head. "No one inside, I swear. Probably a paparazzo who followed her home." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "Call the paper, have them retract." "Already tried," Max said. "They're hiding behind public interest." Ethan exhaled slowly, fury boiling beneath restraint. He stared at the photo of Grace and felt something break inside him, not trust in her, but trust in safety. The next call came from the licensing board for therapists. Grace's superiors had seen the headline. She was called in for questioning. That afternoon, her phone buzzed with messages. She wished she'd never read, colleagues whispering, friends asking, reporters prying. By evening, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the violin leaning against the wall. It looked like a witness to a crime she hadn't committed. She didn't cry, but the silence around her felt like betrayal. The next day, she arrived at Ethan's penthouse earlier than usual. He opened the door before she could knock. His face was drawn, his shirt rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. "You saw it," she said softly. "I did. They called me in," she continued. "They might suspend my license." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'll fix it." "You can't fix this with money," she said. "You can't buy silence, Ethan. You have to live through it." His voice cracked under control. "You think I'll let them destroy you over this? You can't protect me," she said, her tone steady. "You're the reason I need protecting." He flinched. The words landed hard because they were true. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said. "Then don't." She took a step closer. "Tell them the truth. Tell them I was just your therapist." He hesitated, eyes searching hers. "Was you crossed that line the moment you let me matter," she whispered. "And I crossed it the moment I stayed." The silence between them stretched like glass fragile, ready to shatter. Outside, snow began to fall quiet and cruel. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "End it," she said. "At least until this passes." He stared at her, disbelief flickering into desperation. "You're leaving. It's the only way to protect what's left." He turned away, his voice low. "There's nothing left without you." Grace's eyes glistened, but she didn't move. "There will be. You just can't see it yet." He walked to the piano, pressing a single key. The sound trembled through the room like a heartbeat in grief. "This isn't fair," he said. "No," she replied, "but it's necessary." She closed her violin case, the click of the latch sounding final. Sometimes love needs distance to be heard. He looked up, his eyes clouded with a pain that had no outlet. "You're assuming this is love," he said bitterly. Grace smiled sadly. "It's the closest thing either of us has had in years." Then she left. The door closed softly behind her, but the echo it left behind rang like a scream. The following days blurred together. The article spread across social media, dissected by strangers who knew nothing of either of them. Pundits debated ethics, gossip shows replayed her photograph. Ethan stayed silent, refusing interviews, issuing a single statement through his legal team. "All allegations are false." No comment beyond that. But silence didn't clear guilt. It deepened it. Investors grew restless. His board questioned his judgment. Cole Capital's stock dipped for the first time in 3 years. Max urged him to respond publicly, but Ethan refused. "If I speak, they'll twist it," he said. "If I stay silent, they'll invent it," Max countered. "You taught me once." Ethan said coldly that silence is control. "No," Max replied softly. "Grace taught you silence could heal. This isn't that." Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he shut himself inside his penthouse again, locking the world out as he always had. Only now the silence that once protected him felt suffocating. The piano keys gathered dust again. He stopped eating, stopped reading, stopped living. Every sound reminded him of her, the bow against the strings, the laugh she never forced, the warmth she carried effortlessly. He tried to drown it in whiskey, but even the alcohol couldn't erase her. One night, he opened his laptop and saw the unsent email still sitting in his drafts. "She makes silence bearable." His finger hovered over send, but there was no address to send it to anymore. He deleted it. Outside, the storm intensified. The city lights blurred behind the snow. Ethan stood by the window, his reflection staring back at him, hollow and tired. "You're too much for anyone," he whispered again. But the words didn't feel like truth anymore. They felt like surrender. Somewhere downtown, Grace sat alone in her small apartment, holding her violin, but unable to play. She kept thinking about his face, the way he looked when she said goodbye, and wondered if she had done the right thing. Her phone buzzed again, another reporter, another question, but she didn't answer. She poured herself tea, stared at the steam rising, and whispered to the empty room. Sometimes love isn't about staying. It's about leaving before it destroys what's left of you. And yet, as she placed her violin beside her and closed her eyes, she felt a single note echo in her memory, the one he had played the night before she left. Even apart, their silence had found a way to speak. The storm that week was the kind that turned New York into a ghost city. Snow fell thick and relentless, muting sirens, swallowing footsteps, forcing even the restless to be still. Ethan Cole hadn't left his penthouse in days. The fire in the marble hearth burned low, casting faint orange light on the untouched piano. Bottles of whiskey stood like trophies of defeat along the counter. He sat in the dark unshaven, wearing the same shirt he had slept in, staring at the letter from his father still lying on the table. Find someone who reminds you that you're still alive. The words mocked him now. He had found her, and he had driven her away. When the power flickered, he barely noticed. When the phone rang, he didn't answer. When Max knocked, he didn't respond. He had built his empire on control, but control had no meaning when the only person who saw him without it was gone. At midnight, the storm grew wilder. Wind howled against the windows. A sudden knock startled him, 3 sharp raps that did not belong in his world anymore. Ethan hesitated before rising. He opened the door expecting Max, but instead found Grace standing there, snow in her hair, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her violin case slung across her back. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You look terrible," she said softly. "And I don't mean that as a diagnosis. You shouldn't be here," he muttered, stepping aside anyway. She walked in, brushing snow from her coat, her eyes scanning the room, the empty bottles, the cold food, the disarray that betrayed how far he had fallen. "You stopped playing," she said. "You left?" he replied. She met his gaze evenly. "You told me once that silence was control, but this isn't silence. This is punishment." He looked away, jaw tightening. "You came here to lecture me." "No," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "I came because you need to talk." To you, he almost laughed, but it came out broken. "You lost everything because of me." "I lost my job," she corrected. "Not my voice." He turned sharply. "What do you want from me, Grace?" "The truth," she said. "The real one, the one you've been burying for half your life." He said nothing. The room filled with the sound of wind and his uneven breathing. "You think I don't know what's eating you alive?" she continued. "It's not the rumors. It's the fear. You're terrified of being seen." "You don't know anything about me," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Grace took a step closer. "Then tell me. Prove me wrong." Ethan's hands shook as he poured a drink, but he didn't lift it to his lips. Instead, he stared into the glass as though it contained every mistake he'd ever made. "When I was 16, he began slowly, I was told I was abnormal." His voice cracked on the word. "I didn't even understand what it meant at first. I only knew it made me different. Every girl I was with after that, when they saw me, they reacted the same way. Shock, pity, sometimes disgust. One cried, another laughed, and I realized something. I wasn't someone people wanted to know. I was something they wanted to escape." Grace didn't interrupt. Her eyes softened, but she said nothing. "It became easier to build an empire than to build a relationship," Ethan said bitterly. "Money doesn't flinch. Walls don't run away. I thought if I made myself untouchable, no one could hurt me again. But you made me forget that rule." He looked at her, then raw and unguarded. "That night when you touched my hand at the piano, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, and it terrified me." Grace stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You think being different makes you unlovable, but it's the only thing that makes you real." Ethan's breath shuddered. "Every woman I've ever been with left when they saw the truth." "What makes you think you're any different?" "Because I didn't come here to see what's wrong with you," she said. "I came to remind you what's right." Her words landed like light in a room long sealed from the sun. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan set the glass down and whispered, "You should go. If anyone sees you here again, they'll destroy you." Grace shook her head. "They already tried." "And I'm still standing." She stepped closer until she was within reach. "You don't need to hide from me, Ethan." He closed his eyes, every muscle in his body tense. "You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to trust me," she said. "Just once." The air between them pulsed with the weight of everything unspoken. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached up and touched her cheek barely, like testing the edge of a dream. When she didn't pull away, he let out a sound that was half relief, half despair. "I'm broken," he whispered. "No," she said. "You're just unfinished." That broke him completely. His defenses crumbled, his breath hitched, and the years of shame, isolation, and self-loathing poured out all at once. He buried his face in his hands, and for the first time in his adult life, he cried. Grace moved closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You've carried this alone for too long," she said. "You don't have to anymore." "What do you want from me?" he asked through the tears. "Nothing," she said, "just honesty." He lifted his head, his voice rough. "Then here it is. I don't know how to love someone without destroying them." "Then learn," she said softly. "With me." He stared at her, stunned by the simplicity of it. "You'd risk everything. Love is always a risk," she replied. "But so is loneliness. One just hurts slower." Outside, thunder rolled, echoing through the glass. Inside, time seemed to stop. Ethan reached for her hand this time, steady. Their fingers intertwined, tentative but real. "If we continue," she whispered, "it won't be therapy anymore." "What will it be? Love," she said. And somehow the word didn't scare him anymore. They stood there for a long time, the fire flickering beside them, the storm raging beyond the windows, the world oblivious to the quiet miracle unfolding in a penthouse that had once known only silence. When she finally turned to leave, he didn't stop her. She paused at the door, glancing back. "Tomorrow," she said. "Let the music start again." He knotted his throat, too tight to speak. When the elevator doors closed behind her, Ethan looked at his reflection in the glass once more. For the first time, he didn't see a man to be pitied. He saw someone still capable of beginning again. The next evening arrived with the kind of stillness that made the city seem like it was holding its breath. Snow had stopped falling, but the air carried that soft electric quiet that follows every storm when everything feels suspended between what was and what could be. Ethan Cole stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, buttoning a clean shirt for the first time in days. His reflection looked older, tired but human again. The whiskey bottles were gone. The piano downstairs was uncovered. He had asked Grace to come not as a therapist, not out of guilt, but because he could not bear the thought of that silence without her voice in it. When the elevator chimed, his pulse quickened. He opened the door before she could knock. Grace stood there, her hair slightly damp from the cold, her coat dusted with the last traces of snow. She smiled faintly, and the sight of it melted something inside him. "You look better," she said. "I feel worse," he admitted. "But maybe that's progress." She stepped in, eyes scanning the room, noticing the absence of clutter, the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee. "You cleaned up." "You were right," he said. It wasn't silence. It was punishment. She set her violin down carefully. "And now," he said quietly, "I want to hear something again." He gestured toward the piano. She nodded and opened her violin case. They didn't speak as they tuned. The only sounds were the soft clicks of pegs and the sigh of strings tightening. Then without warning, she began to play. The melody was tender, almost fragile, like a question asked in the dark. Ethan followed her lead, his fingers finding the keys hesitantly, then more certain. Their notes wove together, not perfect, but alive. The song grew into something neither had planned, improvised, breathing human. When it ended, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of heartbeat. Grace looked at him. "You stopped flinching," she said. "Maybe I stopped expecting pain," he replied. She set her violin down. "Then you're ready." "For what?" "To stop hiding." He didn't move as she crossed the space between them. Her steps were unhurried, sure the same rhythm she used when walking him through fear. When she stood in front of him, she reached up and touched his face gently, her fingers cool against his jaw. Still afraid, she asked. Terrified, he said. "Good," she whispered. "It means this matters." His breath caught as she traced the edge of his cheekbone, the line of his collar. Every nerve in his body screamed to retreat, but he stayed. Her touch wasn't demanding. It was patient, a language of permission. "Tell me if it's too much," she said softly. "Everything about you is too much," he murmured, his voice breaking. She smiled sadly. "Then let's redefine what enough feels like." Her hand moved to his chest, resting over his heartbeat. It was racing, uneven, wild. "You're not broken, Ethan," she said. "You're just someone who's been told love has limits. I'm telling you it doesn't." His throat tightened. "And what if I hurt you? Then I'll show you that love doesn't hurt," she said. "It heals." He closed his eyes as she leaned closer. Her forehead touched his, their breaths mingling. It wasn't a kiss yet, just proximity, a quiet test of how much truth they could bear. Then slowly she kissed him. It wasn't desperate, it wasn't perfect, it was real. The kiss deepened with a kind of reverence, two people learning each other's language without fear. His hands trembled when they touched her waist, but she guided them, patient, steady. Every movement was a promise that gentleness could coexist with desire, that love could be both tender and strong. When they finally broke apart, he was trembling. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "Neither do I," she admitted. "But we'll learn." She took his hand and led him toward the couch near the fire. They sat in silence, fingers intertwined, watching the flames dance. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to fill the space with words. The warmth of her hand against his was enough. Eventually she stood and reached for his shirt buttons, pausing to search his eyes. "Only if you want this," she said. "I do," he said. "But not because I'm ready, because I can't keep pretending I'm not." She smiled, and together they stripped away the layers, not just fabric, but the years of fear that had wrapped around him like armor. The act that followed was slow, careful, and painfully honest. It wasn't lust that guided them. It was the ache of two people who had lived too long without being seen. Every touch was hesitant, then certain. Every breath shared was an act of courage. Grace moved with quiet confidence, grounding him when he faltered, reminding him that he was safe. The world outside vanished. There was only skin-warmth breath and the unspoken truth that for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel alone inside his own body. When it was over, they lay together under the dim light of the fire, the city's glow faint beyond the glass. Ethan stared at the ceiling, afraid to speak in case it all vanished. Grace's head rested on his shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "You're shaking," she said. "I don't know what this is," he murmured. "It's peace," she said. "You're just not used to it." He turned to her, studying her face. There was no judgment, no pity, only presence. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Because you needed someone to stay," she said. "And I needed someone to remind me that I could." He exhaled shakily, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her skin. "You risked everything to be here." "So did you," she said. "That's what makes it worth it." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. The fire dimmed, casting their shadows on the wall like two figures learning to exist in the same frame. Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he slept deeply without interruption, without fear. When he woke hours later, morning light had filled the room, pale and forgiving. Grace was still beside him, her breathing, even her hand resting over his heart. He lay there quietly memorizing the moment, the stillness, the warmth, the miracle of not being afraid. The world beyond the windows would come crashing back soon with its rumors and noise and consequences. But right then, in that fragile sliver of dawn, Ethan Cole, the untouchable billionaire, was simply a man who had finally been touched and healed. The morning after the storm, sunlight spilled through the tall glass windows of the penthouse, painting the room in soft gold. Ethan Cole stood barefoot by the piano, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, watching Grace sleep on the couch, her hair tangled, her violin case resting beside her. For the first time, he didn't feel like an intruder in his own life. The air was warm, almost fragile, like a new beginning, afraid of being touched too hard. He'd spent years believing that love was something meant for other people, softer, simpler people who hadn't been scarred by shame or burdened by power. But now, looking at Grace, he understood what his father's letter had meant. Find someone who reminds you that you're still alive. He had. He'd just never imagined it would hurt and heal at the same time. Grace stirred, blinking awake. "You're watching me," she murmured, her voice rough from sleep. "I'm learning to," he said. She smiled, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "You're different this morning. You're imagining things." "No," she said, standing, "you're lighter." He set the cup down and crossed the room. "Maybe I'm just less afraid of what I see." Or maybe, she said softly, "You've finally started to see yourself." He didn't answer. Instead, he kissed her forehead, then turned toward the piano. "Play with me," he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. They played together without speaking, the notes blending, imperfect but alive. It wasn't music for performance. It was music for healing. When they finished, Grace closed her violin case. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "My license hearing is today. The board meets in 3 hours." Ethan froze. "You're still going?" "I have to," she said. "If I don't, they'll revoke it by default." "I can go with you," he said immediately. "That'll make it worse," she replied gently. "They already think I was compromised." He clenched his jaw. "You were never compromised. You were human." "Exactly," she said. "And they don't know what to do with that." She walked to him, placing her hand over his heart. "Promise me you won't try to fix this with money." He exhaled. "Grace." "Promise." He looked into her eyes and nodded. "I promise." She smiled faintly. "That's all I needed." Hours later, she sat before the review board, 3 people behind a long mahogany table, their faces polite but distant. They asked her questions, clinical, precise, designed to extract confession rather than truth. "Did you develop personal feelings for your client?" one asked. "Yes," she said simply. "And did you act on them?" Grace hesitated, then answered with the quiet courage that had always defined her. "Yes, but not while I was his therapist. I ended treatment before that. What happened after was not professional misconduct, it was human connection." "And do you understand?" another board member said coldly. "How that reflects on our field?" Grace met their gaze steadily. "It reflects that we are not machines. We are witnesses to pain. Sometimes that pain recognizes itself in us. And when healing turns into love, it isn't corruption, it's transformation." The room went silent. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, the chairwoman sighed. "We'll deliberate. You'll receive notice in writing." Grace thanked them and left. Outside, the city was alive again, snow-melting sunlight reflecting off puddles, taxis honking. She inhaled deeply, letting the noise wash over her. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like running. Meanwhile, at Cole Capital, Ethan was preparing for the charity gala he had almost canceled. It was an annual event his father had started raising money for music therapy programs across the country. This year, it meant more than it ever had. He arrived early, refusing the PR team's request for a prepared speech. When the cameras started flashing, he didn't hide behind tinted glass or corporate smiles. He stood under the stage lights, adjusting the microphone. "Some of you know me as the man who hates being seen." He began, his voice steady but raw. "That used to be true. I built walls so high I forgot what sunlight looked like. I told myself it was safer that way. But lately, I've learned something. Hiding doesn't make you invincible, it just makes you invisible." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I've also learned that healing doesn't always come from medicine or money," he continued. "Sometimes it comes from music, sometimes from someone brave enough to play it in your silence." He paused, eyes scanning the audience until they found her. Grace stood near the back of the room wearing a simple black dress, her hair down. Their eyes met. For a moment, everything else faded: the reporters, the investors, the lights. "Tonight," Ethan said, "I'd like to announce the creation of the Grace Foundation for Emotional Healing Through Music. It will fund programs that help people find sound in their silence. Because silence," he added, glancing toward her, "isn't the end. It's where the song begins." The applause was immediate, thunderous, genuine. Grace stood motionless, tears blurring her vision. When the crowd surged toward Ethan afterward, she slipped away quietly, overwhelmed by what she'd just witnessed. But Ethan wasn't done. He broke from the group and followed her outside into the cold night. She was standing beneath the awning, breathing hard, her emotions unraveling. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, wiping her eyes. "You put my name where it belongs," he said. "You gave me back my voice. The least I could do was make sure the world heard yours." She shook her head, half laughing, half crying. "You're going to get us both crucified by the media." "Maybe," he said, stepping closer, "but at least we'll be crucified for the truth." "Ethan," she whispered, "they'll tear you apart." "They already did," he said softly. "But this time I know who I am." The words hit her harder than she expected. She reached for him, and he caught her hand, pressing it to his chest. "I don't care what they say anymore," he said. "All I care about is being seen and seeing you." The next morning, the tabloids predictably exploded. "Billionaire declares love for scandalized therapist. Cole's foundation named after his mistress." But for every cruel headline, there were thousands of comments online praising his vulnerability, his honesty, his courage to defy expectation. Public opinion began to shift. What had been scandal turned into story. What had been rumor became redemption. Grace's board reconsidered her case. They called her back the following week, reinstating her license with conditions. "We believe you crossed a line," the chairwoman said, "but we also believe you turned it into something meaningful. Be careful with the next person you save." Grace left with her head high. Outside the building, Ethan was waiting, leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, looking almost nervous. "How did it go?" he asked. "I'm still a therapist," she said, smiling. "And you, still a fool in love?" he replied. She laughed, and the sound was the sweetest music he had ever heard. That evening, they visited a youth center where the first Grace Foundation program was launching. Ethan watched as children with trembling hands learned to hold instruments for the first time. Grace guided them patiently, her voice gentle, her laughter genuine. He saw her through the eyes of the people she healed, someone who turned pain into beauty. When she looked at him across the room, he knew she saw him the same way. Later, as they walked home beneath the city lights, he said, "You were right. Silence wasn't my punishment, it was my waiting." She stopped and turned to face him. "Waiting for what for you?" he said. She smiled softly, "Then learn to be seen, Ethan. Not just by me, by yourself." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. For once, he didn't look away when people stared. Let them see, he thought. For the first time, he wasn't hiding from the world. He was part of it. A year passed, but Ethan Cole still remembered every note of that night, the night the city stopped being a cage and became a stage instead. The Grace Foundation had flourished beyond what either of them imagined. It funded community music therapy centers in 7 states, employed hundreds of teachers, and gave instruments to children who had never touched one before. Grace became the quiet heart of it all, refusing interviews, preferring to let the music speak for her. Ethan, meanwhile, stepped fully into the light he once avoided. He no longer hid from cameras or crowds. He learned to stand before the world imperfect but unashamed. They lived together now in a smaller apartment downtown, far from the glass penthouse that had once been his fortress. The piano followed them there, a little scuffed from the move, but alive again. Every morning he played before she woke. Every evening she played before they slept. Their home was filled not with silence, but with music, laughter, and the soft chaos of being seen. Yet, as their first gala for the Foundation's anniversary approached, Ethan grew restless. He had spent weeks planning something he had never done before, not a merger, not a launch, but a confession. The event was held in the same concert hall where his mother once performed when he was a child. The room shimmered with candlelight, the air alive with anticipation. Grace stood backstage wearing a pale silver dress that glowed beneath the lights. She had been asked to perform the final piece of the night, a new composition titled Enough. She thought the title belonged to her. She didn't know Ethan had written it. When her name was called, she stepped on stage with her violin bow trembling slightly in her hand. The audience fell silent as she began to play. The melody was gentle at first, then swelling with emotion, hope, fear, forgiveness, all blending into one. Halfway through, another sound joined hers, a piano. The audience turned. Ethan had walked on stage, dressed simply in black, sitting at the grand piano like he belonged there. Grace froze the bow, hovering mid-air. "Keep playing," he whispered across the stage. She obeyed the music, deepening between them like a conversation in a language only they understood. When the final note faded, he stood and crossed to her. The applause rose like thunder, but quickly died when he held up his hand. The spotlight dimmed until only the two of them remained illuminated. Ethan took the microphone, his voice low but steady. "A year ago," he began, "I was a man who hid behind numbers, behind glass, behind shame. I had everything the world said I should want, and nothing that made me feel alive. Then a woman walked into my silence and taught me that sound isn't just heard, it's felt." He turned to Grace. "You told me once that music is what keeps the broken parts together. You were right. But what you didn't tell me is that love is the melody that gives it meaning." Grace's eyes glistened as he reached into his pocket. Instead of a velvet box, he held up something small, a single worn piano key, polished, smooth-threaded on a delicate gold chain. "This," he said softly, "came from the piano that sat in my father's study. The one I played the day I stopped believing I could be loved. I kept it all these years as a reminder of who I was. Now I want it to remind me of who I am with you." He took her hand. "Grace Hale, you made me believe that I wasn't too much. that I was simply waiting for someone big enough to love me. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. You taught me to hear again, to feel again, to live again. So tonight, before everyone who once doubted me, including myself, I want to ask you something." He knelt, not with grand theatrics, but with quiet reverence, as if the act itself was sacred. The room held its breath. "Will you marry me?" Grace covered her mouth with her hands, tears spilling freely now. The world around her blurred into nothing but him, the man who had once been made of stone, now standing in front of her, unguarded, offering his heart. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, Ethan, 1,000 times yes." The audience erupted into applause, but Ethan didn't hear it. He slipped the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin. "You're sure?" he murmured. "You're not afraid of loving you?" she said, smiling through tears. "I'm terrified. But I've learned that love worth having always begins with fear." He laughed softly, pulling her into his arms. The crowd rose to their feet, but in that moment, they were alone. The world outside the spotlight no longer mattered. The music resumed, soft orchestral, the sound of their song reborn. As they kissed, camera flashes went off, but Ethan didn't flinch this time. He didn't hide. He let himself be seen not as the untouchable billionaire, but as a man made human by love. Afterward, the celebration spilled into the night. Guests congratulated them. Reporters shouted questions. But Ethan and Grace slipped away quietly through a side door, their fingers intertwined. Outside, the air was crisp, the city alive with light. "You planned all of that," she said, shaking her head. Every word he admitted, every note, even the key, especially the key. "It was time I stopped locking myself away." She leaned against him. "You realize you've turned your life into a symphony." "No," he said. "You did." They walked toward the car, laughter bubbling between them. A group of children from the foundation spotted them and ran over, waving programs and asking for autographs. Grace bent down, signing them all. Ethan watched, his chest tight with gratitude. This simple moment felt more valuable than all the billions he'd ever earned. Later, when they returned home, the city quieted behind them. Grace placed the piano key pendant on the nightstand, its surface gleaming in the lamplight. "Do you ever think about the past?" she asked as they undressed. "Every day," he said, "but it no longer owns me." She smiled, lying beside him. "You've come a long way from the man who wouldn't let anyone touch him." "Because you taught me that touch isn't just physical," he said. "It's trust." She kissed him softly. "Then trust that whatever comes next, we'll face it together." He nodded, resting his forehead against hers. "I do." Outside, a faint melody drifted from the street below, someone playing violin in the distance, the notes familiar and free. Grace listened, smiling. "Do you hear that?" always Ethan said. And as they drifted to sleep, the city hummed with their song. Two hearts, once silenced by fear, now brave enough to make music again. 1 year later, spring returned to New York with the quiet confidence of something that had endured a long winter and survived. The city hummed with music again, not from concert halls or luxury penthouses, but from the corners where laughter met hope. Inside a renovated brownstone in Brooklyn, sunlight streamed through tall windows onto rows of children holding small instruments, violins, flutes, drums, keyboards, each one labeled with a tiny gold plaque that read, "The Grace Foundation." Ethan Cole stood at the back of the room, sleeves rolled up, tie forgotten, helping a boy adjust the height of a piano bench. "Better?" he asked. The boy nodded shyly, pressing a key that sang out a clear note. Grace crossed the room, her hair pulled into a loose bun, her hands carrying sheet music. He's getting better every week, she said softly. Ethan smiled. He reminds me of someone. You, maybe, she teased. No, he said. Someone who taught me that sound isn't about perfection. Grace laughed, the sound bright and familiar. That was never my lesson. It was, he said, watching her with quiet affection. I just wasn't ready to hear it then. She sat beside him on the piano bench, their shoulders touching. You know, she said, sometimes I still can't believe this place exists. A year ago, I thought I'd lose everything. You did, he said gently. But look what you built from it. Her eyes softened as she looked around. The walls were covered with children's drawings. Heart stars, a crooked sketch of her playing violin. Do you ever miss it? She asked. The penthouse, the view. Ethan shook his head. I used to think being above the city meant I was safe. But all I really was alone. Down here it's louder, messier, but it's real. And real is better. She rested her head on his shoulder. You've changed. No, he said. I've just stopped hiding. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sound of a drumbeat from the other room. Grace traced small circles on the back of his hand. Do you ever think about the night we met every day, he said. Especially when I hear silence. Why silence? Because that's where you always appear. She smiled, eyes glistening. You know, for someone who claimed he wasn't poetic, you're getting dangerously close. You're rubbing off on me. Good, she said. You needed more music. And you, he countered, needed someone who would listen. I found that, she said quietly. In you. The sound of children laughing filled the hallway, breaking their stillness. A little girl ran up, clutching a violin almost her size. Miss Grace, I did it, she said, breathless. Grace knelt down. Show me. The girl played a few shaky notes, then looked up expectantly. Beautiful, Grace said, hugging her. Do you know what that song is called? No, it's called Enough. The girl grinned, then ran off again. Grace stood, her eyes following the child. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met? Ethan looked up at her, smiling softly. I wouldn't have learned that enough isn't about having everything. It's about knowing you don't need to. She kissed him lightly. That's the answer I was hoping for. As afternoon faded into evening, the children left one by one, their laughter echoing down the stairs. Grace locked the door, turning back to him. You ready always? He said. They walked outside, the golden hour painting the street in honey and shadow. The city moved around them, buses, sighing street musicians playing, people shouting across crosswalks. Once that noise would have made Ethan retreat. Now it sounded like belonging. They reached the park at the corner, where a small open-air stage had been built for the Foundation's weekend performances. A few volunteers were already setting up chairs. Grace unpacked her violin and handed him a piece of folded paper. What's this? He asked. Your part, she said. A duet. Of course, she said, her eyes shining. We started with music. It only makes sense we keep playing. He unfolded the paper. At the top in her handwriting were the words, The Sound of Enough. She placed her violin under her chin bow, poised. Ready. He sat at the upright piano that had been rolled onto the stage, his hands finding the keys. Always, he said again. The first notes drifted into the evening air, soft but steady. Passers-by slowed, listening. A woman pushing a stroller stopped. A man on a bicycle leaned his head back to catch the sound. The melody rose and fell, full of life, full of memory. It wasn't flawless, but it didn't need to be. When the final chord faded, Grace lowered her bow, smiling. You know, she said, that might be my favorite sound. What? He asked. The one that comes after the music, the quiet that reminds you it happened. He nodded, understanding. Maybe love is like that too. Maybe, she said. They packed up together, their hands brushing the simple intimacy of a life built not on perfection, but on presence. As they walked home, Ethan glanced up at the city skyline. Somewhere far above his old penthouse still stood its windows, dark and silent. But down here on the street, where laughter and music tangled in the air, he felt what he never had there: peace. Grace squeezed his hand. "You're thinking," she said. "I'm listening," he replied. She smiled. "To what?" "To everything," he said. "Even silence can sing." She laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they disappeared into the hum of the city. The billionaire who once feared touch, and the woman who taught him that love, like music, doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be heard. If this story touched something deep inside, you take a moment. Don't scroll, yet just breathe. Maybe you've also carried something the world said was too much. Maybe you've hidden parts of yourself because someone once made you believe love was only for the perfect, the polished, the easy to love. But the truth is, the most beautiful stories are written from the cracks, from the places we thought were unlovable. Ethan spent years believing his difference made him a monster, that success was the only shield strong enough to hide his pain. Grace didn't heal him with money or fame or grand gestures. She healed him by staying, by listening, by seeing him when no one else dared to. And maybe that's what love really is: not a rescue, but recognition. A mirror that says, you are enough exactly as you are. If this story made your heart ache and then breathe again, it's because deep down, you know what it means to want to be seen. You know the loneliness of pretending, the quiet of nights where silence feels heavier than sound. But you also know somewhere within you that healing begins when someone reaches across that silence and whispers, "I'm not going anywhere." That's what this story was always about: not wealth, not beauty, not power, but the courage to stay when everything inside you wants to run. So if you've ever felt too big, too sensitive, too broken, or too strange, remember, you are not too much. You just haven't yet met the person or the moment big enough to hold all that you are. When that day comes, don't hide. Let them see you. Let them hear your music. And if you believe stories like this can remind people of that truth, share this one. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Tell me if you've ever found someone who saw you before you saw yourself. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story that might just reach the part of your heart you've been keeping quiet. Because here in this little corner of the internet, we believe in love that heals love, that forgives love, that rebuilds. We believe every silence deserves a song. And maybe tonight, after this story ends, you'll hear your own beginning.